Dwight D. Eisenhower, 34th President of the United States, five-star general who commanded forces against the Axis powers in World War II, today considered one of the greatest presidents, known to many by his nickname Ike. He was born in Texas in 1890. He was one of six boys. His parents were very strict, especially his dad. They were Mennonites, but then they became International Bible students, later known as Jehovah's Witnesses. They had daily readings and Bible studies, and his mother opposed his love of reading history books about military strategists like Alexander the Great and George Washington. She even locked the books up, but her pacifism did run off on him later, as we shall see. He went to West Point, gained a reputation for being a bit of a rascal, but he excelled in sports, especially football and baseball. When he met Mamie Dowd, who was 6 years younger, he proposed just a few months later. Now, being in the military meant being away from the family too often, but he adored his son, Dowd Dwight, who they nicknamed Icky. Now, Eisenhower was on leave when Icky was born, but sadly, he was at Icky's bedside 3 years later when the little boy died of scarlet fever. The couple grieved for about a year, and Eisenhower later said he thinks he had a nervous breakdown. They never really recovered. But in 1922, they had another son. John Eisenhower, who lived a long, prosperous life, went to West Point like his dad, and died in 2013. Now, Eisenhower loved to play golf, and he also enjoyed his favorite pastime when he wanted to be alone, oil painting. When World War I broke out, he looked forward to serving in combat, but instead he was ordered to train and assess the troops. Now, after the war, he and a young officer named George Patton became friends, and this friendship lasted through World War II when they were both generals. Patton and Ike tested and studied tank warfare, believing that another world war would come about in 20 years or so. They were right. Ike served under Generals Pershing, MacArthur, and Marshall. He distinguished himself as he moved up the ranks. He worked under General MacArthur in the Philippines and did his duty. He met and negotiated with several different personality types, giving him the experience for what destiny had in store for him. He became a brigadier general by 1941. Then came World War II, and Ike's organizational skills made him commander of Operation Torch, where he organized the invasion in North Africa and then Sicily. He made costly mistakes, but he learned, gained experience, and he learned to handle and argue Churchill, Montgomery, President Roosevelt. He never participated in combat, but he did see the aftermath of battles, and he mentioned the horrors of walking for acres and acres and seeing dead bodies strung along the African plains. By this point, he was a full-fledged general, and then came the big one, Operation Overlord, an Allied invasion into Europe, where Ike became supreme commander of all military corps. Many of us know how hard it is to prepare a wedding, for example. Imagine having a staff of 1,600 and keeping a secret and planning the largest military invasion in the history of the world, and having to deal with complex, arrogant personalities like Patton and British General Montgomery, and have to appear optimistic, and have to look into fuel and food and water and supplies and landing crafts and planes and logistics and weather and tides, and the fear of defeat while telling all the Allied leaders that it would be a success. Ike suffered insomnia, drank more than he should have, and chain-smoked all day. Then came D-Day, June 6, 1944, a costly but successful invasion of France and the beginning of the push into Europe. He argued with Montgomery and Churchill, but he retained their trust. The war went on. There were many battles, many talks, many disagreements, many setbacks, many successes. But Ike kept his head over all of this, gained invaluable experience in handling different personalities and situations. Then on May 7, 1945, the war in Europe was over. Now, Ike opposed the use of the atomic bomb in Japan, and he was also disappointed that the Soviets became so uncooperative in post-war Europe. But then came 1948, and he was asked to run for president. He decided to run as a Republican and became known as the five-star general who defeated Hitler. Many felt he would win easily. He picked as his running mate Senator Richard Nixon. Now, Ike later grew not to like Nixon very much, and he even thought of replacing him before his second term, but he kept him. He kept him and he won, becoming the 34th President of the United States. He also stomached the disagreeable task of working with Senator McCarthy, who was persecuting many with his communist witch hunts. He tolerated McCarthy, but when McCarthy accused General Marshall, his mentor, of communism, that was the last straw. Ike waited until after the election, and then he covertly destroyed McCarthy's reputation and credibility. Now here's a nice story. When Ike was running for president, his grandson, David, who was 8 years old, met Jill, Nixon's daughter. Well, they hit it off, years went by, and, well, they got married. And they are still married today, going on 48 years. Now, Ike wanted to balance the budget and slow the spread of communism, but he found the arms race stupid and immoral, and soon made his famous Chance for Peace speech, where he stated clearly, "Every gun made, every warship launched, every rocket fired, signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. This is not a way of life at all, under the cloud of threatening war. It is humanity hanging from a cross of iron." Well, despite his kind words and his efforts, the Cold War continued. Now, one thing Ike was successful at was creating the interstate highway system. The federal highways was really a military effort, since he believed that communication and transportation between the states would be essential if a Soviet invasion ever occurred. Today, the interstate keeps growing and growing. In 1953, Joseph Stalin died, and Nikita Khrushchev became the Soviet leader. Rude, crude, when Khrushchev visited the United States, he was given a tour of the country. He later said he wasn't impressed. And when the Soviets tested a hydrogen bomb, the world grew nervous. Now, Ike believed that it was better to have a huge nuclear arsenal and cut the military budget of other things, saving money for domestic concerns. Khrushchev was concerned about the American arsenal, and the Soviets began stockpiling nuclear weapons in mass. It was Ike that articulated the domino theory, that if one country fell to communism, another would follow. So he relied on the CIA to help depose of communist or extreme leaders. When the leader of Iran, the Shah, was deposed by the new Prime Minister Mossadegh, who then wanted to take over the British oil wells in that country, well, the CIA had the Shah put back into power. When freely elected Jacobo Arbenz of Guatemala expressed extreme liberal views, he was overthrown with the CIA's help, and a U.S.-friendly Carlos Armas was put in his place. And when rebel Fidel Castro took over in Cuba, at first he appeared friendly to the U.S., but when he cozied up to the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, all knew he had communist leanings. Ike authorized the invasion of Cuba through the Bay of Pigs, which would take place under the Kennedy administration. Of course, it failed, and Castro's regime is still in place. The Soviets launched into space a satellite named the Sputnik, and the Americans complained about losing the new space race and feared being spied upon. Ike invested into the new American satellites and the technology, but he regretted the expense. Now, Ike's show of strength did help end the Korean War. Then, when China bombed 2 tiny Taiwanese islands, his whole staff pressured him to invade China and even use the atomic bomb. They told him this 5 times, and he was alone in his assessment. He would not use the bomb, but he did test the bombs and flew several battle planes and ships nearby, successfully getting the Chinese to back away. In the Middle East, since Israel had become a nation in 1948, it had been threatened and attacked by several Arab states. Egypt had taken over the Suez Canal and threatened to cut off oil shipments. France and Britain invaded. Well, the United States threatened with a United Nations resolution, and the Soviets planned to attack. It could have caused another world war, but thankfully, in the face of this pressure, the nations had pulled out of Egypt. In Hungary in 1956, what started as a student protest against the government soon turned to a full-scale rebellion. Well, the Soviets came in with their troops and squashed the rebellion. Eisenhower condemned the Soviet crackdown, but he did not intervene. When we think of Vietnam, many think of the American involvement in the Vietnam War, not remembering that the French were fighting there first, protecting their Asian colonial lands. Eventually they were chased out, they pulled out. And even though Eisenhower sent money and supplies to help the French, and he did send some military advisors, he didn't commit the American troops. Now, to keep South Vietnam from becoming the first domino falling to a communist government, the United States helped organize the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization along with other countries. When it comes to civil rights, Ike gets high marks, even though he doesn't get much credit. He pushed for the desegregation of the armed forces that Truman wanted. And when some military leaders complained that many white troops didn't want to work alongside black troops and that the morale would drop and that the people from the South were not ready, Ike said that their morale would drop further if they didn't comply, and he threatened to cut the military budget. He appointed Earl Warren to the Supreme Court, partly because of his progressive views. And when the Supreme Court said that segregated schools were unconstitutional and one school in Arkansas refused to comply and allow black students in, Ike sent the National Guard to escort 9 students into the Little Rock High School in Arkansas. Ike signed the Civil Rights Act of 1957 and said he wanted to make Washington, D.C. a model for the rest of the country. He said that an accomplishment was not the end result, but that it was a journey. It was during these years that Alaska and Hawaii became the 49th and the 50th state. Now, Ike's health wasn't good. He used to smoke 2 to 3 packs of cigarettes a day, and it had taken its toll. He suffered a heart attack in 1955. This attack brought about an aneurysm, which then brought about aphasia. He then acquired Crohn's disease and needed intestinal surgery. In later years, he had a gallbladder removed, and it had 16 stones. Between 1955 and until his death, Ike suffered 7 heart attacks. Now, the 8 years of Ike's administration were of economic prosperity and relative peace. He still had dreams of disarmament with the Soviets, but these dreams were dashed when, just before going to a summit with Khrushchev, an American U-2 spy plane was shot down in Soviet territory. At first, it was said that it was a weather plane that lost course, then that it was a rogue element that worked on its own, but when the American pilot, Francis Gary Powers, was captured alive, there was no denying that the United States was spying on the Soviet Union. The pilot was later traded for a Soviet spy and brought home. If you saw the Steven Spielberg movie, Bridge of Spies, you know the story. During these years, Ian Fleming wrote his first James Bond novel, Casino Royale, and the first color TV came out on the market. Marilyn Monroe married baseball legend Joe DiMaggio, and Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on the bus. Elvis Presley sang Heartbreak Hotel, and rock legends Buddy Holly, Big Bopper, and Ritchie Valens died together in an airplane crash. The little doll Barbie made its debut, and the Dalai Lama left Tibet in exile. And the Lunar 3 took the first photographs of the dark side of the moon. Before Eisenhower left the presidency, he warned the country of the military-industrial complex and how these huge military contracts and companies could actually dictate policies if we allow them, and that was a danger to our liberties. Eisenhower was disappointed in failing to achieve all that he wanted to do, but he did more than he was often given credit for. He lived through the presidencies of John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, and he saw his vice president, Richard Nixon, get elected. On March 28, 1968, he passed away at the age of 78, and he was buried next to his deceased son, Icky, who had died as a toddler 47 years earlier. Ike's wife would later join them when she passed away in 1979. This is Cool Talk.